Well, good morning, everyone. A quick question. By the raise of hands, who here would consider themselves movie buffs? Fans of movies, following movies. All right, now who here has seen the new Avengers movie? All right, a lot of people. Okay, so I have not yet seen it. The Avengers movie, I've heard, is really good. And it's like the culmination, right, of 10 years, 18 different movies, all these different characters coming together in this final epic conclusion. I can't even give you a spoiler alert because I haven't seen it, so don't worry about that. But this apparently is a monster film, right? Lots and lots of characters. I was looking it up this week. There's, in fact, 40 different characters in the new Avengers movie. And that's part of the reason I haven't seen it yet. Because I didn't grow up reading the comics. I haven't seen all of the other Marvel movies, the other 18 that have been released. So I feel kind of behind and not knowing what the characters are all about. The story of Ant-Man, I've never seen Ant-Man, so I have no idea what he's all about. But he plays a role in the new movie, and there's a bunch of other ones too. So there's a part of me that doesn't really want to submerge myself into this masterful ending without knowing all the characters, without knowing the backstories, to see how they work together and how they work through their backstories throughout the movies, right? And I think good stories deserve that, right? Good stories help with character development, and you want to know what these characters are all about in order to get the most out of the movie. So I've not yet seen it. I don't think I'm going to go and watch all 18 movies beforehand, but I've considered it. But then I add up the hours, and that's just a waste of time. So at some point I'll see it. And I was thinking about that, and I think that same sort of hesitation comes into play when we want to read certain books in the Bible, particularly 1st and 2nd Kings, where we are going to be, but also 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel to a certain degree. And the reason for that is because we've become so familiar with the New Testament, with Jesus and Paul and John and Peter and James. And we get used to it. And then there's a couple Old Testament guys that we're familiar with, like Abraham and Moses, Adam and Eve, certain stories. But then you jump into 1st and 2nd Kings, and all of a sudden you're immersed in this world. And as you're looking around, you're reading names and hearing backstories, it's hard to figure out what's going on. So oftentimes we neglect reading some of those stories. It's an interesting thing, like the new Marvel movie has 40 different characters. 1st and 2nd Kings actually follow 40 different kings throughout the kingdom of Israel and Judah. There are many stories of the kings and the prophets, and it's hard to keep them straight. So, as we begin to jump into the story of Elijah, in an effort to not be overwhelmed by all the different characters, I want to give a little background. But what tends to happen when we don't have background and we don't have character development, if you would, is we get into these stories and we begin to miss out. We miss out on the real purpose, the real truth and the glory behind some of these stories because we're afraid to jump into 1st and 2nd Kings. If we don't do that, we miss out on the stories of Elijah and Elisha. We miss out on the stories of Jehu. You want to read an awesome story, read the story of Jehu. And I'll be honest, a few hours just reading particularly through the life of Elijah and Elisha and Ahab and Jezebel and the prophets of Baal and the kings, the Marvel movies become fairly boring in comparison. I'll be honest with you. The stories found in the book of Kings are far greater than Ant-Man and Spider-Man. They just are. And I assure you, the vision of the Davidic kingdom that starts with David, actually starts before that, but it comes into some clarity in David and the prophets, it's way better than Wakanda. I did see Black Panther. And Wakanda looks great, right? The city, the world in which they live. The Davidic kingdom is way better than that. It just is. The power of Elijah is far greater than the power of Thor. And Jezebel is way more sinister than Loki. The book of Kings has some fascinating stories. And these stories are to form us, and they are to prepare us for Jesus. And not only that, but they teach us how to live. They teach us how to live in a world with false worship constantly coming around us and constantly pulling us and begging us to bow the knee to these idols that our world would construct for us. So for the next couple months, we're going to be looking at the story of Elijah. All right, we're going to look at the story of Elijah, and that story is found in 1st and 2nd Kings. It's interesting. 1st and 2nd Kings, we have them as two different books in our Bible. Originally, it was just one book, right? One scroll, one book. And when the Bible was collected, it was long, so they split it up into two, 1st and 2nd Kings. But it's one story going all the way through. And it just continues the story of 1st and 2nd Samuel. All right, so I'm going to invite you all to turn your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 16. 1 Kings 16. And this morning, we're going to start with some introductions, right? Because I want you to know the characters of the story. I want you to know what's going on. I want you to know the background. So we'll introduce you to the villains, and we'll introduce you to Elijah and some of the other characters at play in his life. But before we introduce you to the characters, I want to set the stage of what's happening in the history of redemption, right? So if we start in Genesis and come all the way to 1 Kings chapter 16, this story has been building, all right? The story has been building. The book of 1st and 2nd Kings is not one that is somehow excluded from the story of Abraham or the story of David. It's very much a part of these stories. It is moving us forward ultimately to Jesus. So to give a little background, we'll start in the beginning in Genesis 1:1, right? God created the heavens and the earth. I won't go through the whole thing, but basically the book of Genesis gives us the creation story. Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. It then moves us to the flood. Worldwide flood with Noah on the ark, and there's a covenant given to Noah saying, I won't destroy the earth like this ever again. And then once the waters recede, we move into Genesis chapter 11, which is a story of Babel. And we again see the world is no better after the flood than it was before the flood, right? And then right after Babel, we have the call of Abraham. And this is a very important part of the story because the Abrahamic covenant, which is given to Abraham, which includes a land, right? A promised land. It includes a lineage, and it includes a blessing, that you'll be a blessing to all the nations. This covenant begins with Abraham, and it continues to go even through today. So this covenant is very much in play with the story of Elijah. So Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, right? And this is where we get the 12 tribes of Israel. There was a famine in the land, so the 12 sons end up going to Egypt to get some food. This is the story of Joseph, right? And then they stay in Egypt for about 215 years, and they're in slavery there eventually. And then we move into the book of Exodus, and Moses shows up. So Genesis is basically the prelude, right? It's an introduction to the whole story, right? Rapid fire all the way up until Moses, and then things really start to slow down. So with Moses, we have the Exodus. We have a new covenant given, the Mosaic covenant. God creates for himself a people. They wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Moses ends up dying. Joshua takes his place. Joshua brings the people into the promised land, that land that was promised back to Abraham, right? You'll have a land. Joshua brings them in. When Joshua dies, then we have about 415 years of judges to judge the 12 tribes of Israel that came out of Egypt, that wandered, and now they've grown and they need leadership and they need people to speak God's words to them. So God raises up judges, and for 415 years we have judges ruling the people of God. And then that wasn't enough, and they wanted a king. So Saul becomes the first king, and he was not good. And then we get David, and David was a great king. And this is where the story really starts to slow down for us, right? Because now we're getting close to where Elijah is. David was given another covenant from God. And this covenant said that your kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, right? So if you have the Abrahamic covenant kind of going, you have the Davidic covenant come in, and it starts to fill in the gaps. It helps us understand what is this Abrahamic covenant going to look like? How is it that we're going to be a blessing to all the nations? Well, it's through the Davidic covenant, through a kingdom and a king that will sit on an everlasting throne and will rule forever. So that covenant, that promise is given to David. David has a son. His name is Solomon. He builds the temple. The kingdom is starting to take form. Now, Solomon, he was the wisest man that ever lived. And one day when he was out and about, he noticed a young man named Jeroboam. All right? Jeroboam. And he said, man, this guy, he's young. He's a hard worker. He's got a good head on his shoulders. I'm gonna promote him. I want him to be in charge of certain parts of my kingdom. So we promote this guy, Solomon promotes this guy, Jeroboam, all right? And then he has a son named Rehoboam. And then what happens when Solomon dies, the throne, the kingdom belongs to Rehoboam, his son. But Jeroboam had gotten so much influence and so much power that people wanted him to be king. And there was this war and this fight in the kingdom that began with David, the borders that began to be established of what the kingdom of Israel is, that kingdom split in two. All right? And when we come to 1st and 2nd Kings, the first chapter of 1st Kings is David on his deathbed. Right? He's on his deathbed talking to Solomon, talking about what it's going to look like to rule and so on. And then we get to 1 Kings chapter 12. This is where the kingdom splits. And then the rest of 1st and 2nd Kings is following all the different kings of the northern and the southern kingdoms and prophets that come to them, all right? The northern kingdom, they're ornery, they're not good, they're wicked, they're evil people. They never serve God. There's 0 good kings in the northern kingdom. So when the kings would be ruling, God would send prophets to speak the words of God to them, all right? And Elijah is one of those prophets. So this is the story. We've worked our way all the way to 1 Kings 16. Elijah, one of the prophets, speaking to the northern kingdom, the evil kings. And the story begins first by looking at the villains. So look back with me again at 1 Kings chapter 16. And we're going to look at the villains of the story. King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Now, every great story has great villains. I'm not kidding when I say these stories are better than the Marvel ones. All right, I mean, these villains are real. These villains are nasty people. If you look at some of the greatest movies, they've got the greatest villains. Darth Vader is the great villain of Star Wars. With Batman, you have all sorts of villains, but there's one that stands supreme. That's the Joker, right? The Joker is the greatest villain for Batman. Harry Potter has Voldemort. The Chronicles of Narnia have the White Witch. And the story of Elijah has incredibly evil, wicked, sinister villains. And we are introduced to these villains, Ahab and Jezebel, in chapter 16, verse 29. I'll read verses 29 through 31. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, that's the southern kingdom, Ahab, son of Omri, began to reign over Israel. That's the northern kingdom. Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel and Samaria 22 years. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ithbal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshiped him. All right, so we have Ahab introduced as the king. He's the 7th king, right? Since Jeroboam, who went north, there's been 6 other kings, and now Ahab is the 7th. He's the 7th king, and he is unlike the rest, and unlike all those who came before him. His evil, his depravity, his wickedness was far greater than any of the other kings that ruled in the northern kingdom, period. So we have this king, and the kings are supposed to be like David to bring about the Abrahamic covenant. They're supposed to rule with God's justice and mercy in the land. In fact, Deuteronomy talks about what kings should be like, and it says that they are to read the law every single day. They are to keep it with them. They're to have God's word on their mind and on their heart, and they are to live and act in accordance with what God says. But Ahab doesn't do any of these things. He's the seventh out of 20, and he's the worst. Verse 30 says this. It says, "And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all those who were before him." And not only is Ahab an evil king, but he marries perhaps the most evil woman in all the Bible, Jezebel. Jezebel was the daughter of Ethbaal, and he was the king of the Sidonians. And the Sidonians are people from Sidon, which is one of the main Canaanite cities. So if we were to go backwards in that timeline, we would see that the Canaanites are the main villains through Joshua's life and through all the judges. The Canaanites are the ones, they're awful people, right? They reject God and they worship false gods. And here, Ahab, the king of Israel, not only invites a Canaanite princess into his kingdom, which God had worked in the past to get rid of the Canaanites, he not only invites her into the kingdom, but he invites her into his bed as his wife. And this has tragic results. What we see happening is Ahab is pursuing a social program of recanonization, right? We want to bring the Canaanites back. We want that sort of culture here in Israel. He's reinstituting the worship and practices of the Canaanites that Yahweh drove from the land. And part of that worship and part of those practices that the Canaanites were so familiar with and that Ahab and Jezebel are reinstituting in the kingdom is the worship of Baal. Baal is the god of the Canaanites. Remember, we're talking about the villains of the story here. So far, Ahab, Jezebel, bad news. Now we have their deity, Baal. Baal was, in fact, the chief god of the Canaanites. Baal was considered the god of the storm. It was by his power that rain would come, dew, snow, water. He was the god over fertility of the crops, right? As the rain came, the crops grew and blessed the people, thus making Baal very, very important. And Baal worship included everything from bowing down to idols to watching others engage in sexual acts to sacrificing children. So we have Ahab and his wife Jezebel not just breaking God's law, but engaging in high-hand rebellion against God. The king of Israel, God's covenant people, was serving and worshiping Baal. And you know what I think one of the problems is with stories like this, and maybe why when we read it, it still comes across kind of boring at times, is because when we read about Baal and our modernistic, rationalistic thinking, as good children of the Enlightenment, we say, that's goofy. That's just a stone, right? That's just a carved stone that they bow down to. What a bunch of ignorant people that would bow down to a stone. Like, there's no power in that. Well, I think when we start to read these stories and we say, you know what? I think there is actually something with Baal. Like, Baal is real. Not just real as in an idea in somebody's mind or a superstition. I'm talking about real demonic force, like a real demonic entity. I'm talking about he's as real as Satan himself, right? Believe me, these people were not stupid. They would not just worship some god if there was no power in it, right? The Canaanites were prosperous people because of Baal. And there's all sorts of stuff in the Bible that we see this, that makes this ring true for us. And believe me, when Elijah heard about Baal, when Ahab was enticed by Jezebel to go worship Baal, they were not thinking, oh, this is just a superstition, right? I mean, there's real power there. God himself, when he speaks of these false gods, the gods of Egypt, right? Exodus 12:12, when God brought Israel out of Egypt and rained the plagues down on them, it says that he did this in order to judge the gods of Egypt. God went to war with these false gods. And when we say false, we don't mean not real. We mean false as in they speak lies. They're not like Yahweh, the true, holy, righteous God, the creator God. So Baal, as we read through this, he's a real villain. This isn't just some sort of ideology that they're ascribing to, all right? He's very real. Baal had in stories of Baal, he was one of the gods in the Canaanite pantheon that would go to war with other gods in order to become the number one most powerful god. He had his own mountain that people went to worship him. Right? He was considered the god of the underworld. Baal was given credit for crops, as he was the god of, again, rain, thunder, lightning, dew, snow. Baal had borders, he had a kingdom. He had altars and he had temples. He had prophets and he had priests. Right? This guy is serious. The Bible presents Baal as an anti-Yahweh. Baal wants everything that Yahweh is saying is mine. And that power is real. And I'm convinced from the scriptures and a lot of the ancient writings that are out there that talk about Baal that he was actually Satan himself. Right? So when we think about Baal, we can think of this is not just some strange idea. This is actually Satan himself presenting himself as God. And we see this coming out in the Gospel of Mark. If you remember when Jesus cast out demons, and the Pharisees came down, or the Sadducees came down from Jerusalem to see what was going on, and they talk to Jesus, they get some witnesses, they gather the report, and they conclude Jesus is casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul. Now that is the New Testament title for Baal himself, and the gospel writers say this is actually Satan. And Jesus goes on to talk about how he has to bind the strong man, and once he does that, and it moves on. So this idea of Beelzebul is actually Satan himself, and Beelzebul is another name from the Hebrew Beelzebub, which means Baal. All right? So Baal is evil. He's satanic. He's demonic. It's Satan himself. And Ahab, King Ahab, the one who is supposed to rule Yahweh's people and listen to and serve and worship Yahweh, has shaken his fist at God and has bowed the knee to Baal, worshiping Satan. Look with me at verses 32 through 34. It says, he erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria, which is supposed to be where they worship Yahweh in Samaria. Instead, he built a house for Baal and an altar for Baal. And Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. He did more to tick God off than any of the other ones, shaking his fist at God. In the days of Hiel of Bethel, built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up the gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun. You see, Ahab has actually built an altar and a temple for Baal. He also made an Asherah, which was a wooden idol that represented the goddess of fertility, which was very common in Baal worship. And when we read that Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings that were before him. Verse 34 tells us that not only did he do that, not only did he set up worship, but Ahab also oversaw the rebuilding of Jericho. This is a Canaanite stronghold, a Canaanite capital that Joshua and his army marched around 7 times, remember? And it came tumbling down. Jericho was like the devil's den for the Canaanites. And Ahab, with Jezebel by his side, says, yeah, let's rebuild it. And there was a curse promised to Joshua that says, if anybody does this, if anybody tries to rebuild this place, he'll do so at the cost of his firstborn son and his youngest son. Joshua 6:26 says this, Joshua laid an oath on them saying, at that time saying, cursed before the Lord be the man who raises up and rebuilds this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundations, and at the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates. And sure enough, the builder who goes out to build this city actually sacrifices his oldest and his youngest son in order to do it. and Ahab and Jezebel are happy to sacrifice children in order to rebuild this ancient Canaanite stronghold. Rebuilding Jericho actually symbolizes a reversal of the conquest. It's a reversal of everything that God has been doing in the story since the Exodus. And not only that, but it also brings us all the way back to Egypt, and it says Israel has become like a new Egypt, worshiping false gods. Ahab has become a new Pharaoh, causing people to work hard in slave labor and bow down to God, to their God. And the people of God are back in slavery. They are enslaved to demonic powers of Baal, as this has been a great reversal of everything God has been doing. In modern day, Ahab and Jezebel would be like priests, right, in our culture. If you could picture these two characters today, they'd be like priests in the Christian church who fight and celebrate the sacrifice of children. Now today, abortion sacrifices children not necessarily on the altar of Baal, though at the end of the day we'd say it's probably on the altar of Baal. But we think it's the altar of convenience or health or finances. And then Ahab and Jezebel would be like two Christian leaders appointed by God saying, yes, this is good. Let's do this. Let's sacrifice these children. This is a good thing. We want to see families destroyed. They are the priests that turn their back on the Word of God and preach sermons that celebrate the culture of homosexuality and sexual liberty and gender neutrality and victimization, right? These are the things they champion. They are the priests who celebrate pornography and the destruction of the family. Now, these are the villains in this story. In great power, he is king, and it is his wife. They celebrate everything that is against God, and they worship Baal. They worship Satan himself. Do you see how evil and sinister? And this is just the introduction. When we actually get into the story of what they do, we'll see some clarity of the evil nature of these villains. And as the story continues, we'll see how God interacts with Baal. We'll see how God's prophets interact with this king and his wife. But this is the context, all right? Israel is being run by an apostate, Baal-worshiping priest and his pagan wife. Child sacrifices is happening. Ahab has built temples for Baal. Sexual immorality is off the charts. Altars, priests, and prophets of Baal are running with authority in God's land. So we see the villain in this story is Ahab and Jezebel, but we also see that the greater villain working behind the scenes is Baal himself. However, like any good story, when men are faithless, God remains faithful. Those covenants that he made with Abraham and with David are real. They matter, and he is committed to seeing these covenants fulfilled. So what God did is he would raise up prophets to go and speak to the kings, to go and speak to this wayward nation that is running away from God. Prophets in the Bible are introduced in 1 Kings, and they carry through 1 and 2 Kings. And then we have writing prophets, the one who wrote books like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And then we have non-writing prophets, ones who did not write books of the Bible. And Elijah and Elisha are two of the few non-writing prophets. Prophets are the ones who are to go to the kings and give them the words of God. The prophets are the ones who are to call out sin. They hold a mirror up to the king, up to the culture, and that mirror reflects whether or not they reflect God's law and God's character. So if he holds up the mirror of the law and God's perfect standard, the kings look in it and say, man, that is not me. That is not my reflection. The prophets are the ones who call out sin and rebellion. The prophets communicate the blessings and the curses of God to the people, whether or not they are faithful or unfaithful to the covenant. And Elijah is the most significant prophet in the Old Testament. In fact, Elijah is probably the greatest prophet that we have. Now, I know Jesus said John the Baptist is the greatest, but he comes in the spirit of Elijah, which is pretty cool. Part of the reason is that it is Elijah who inaugurates this prophetic epic of time, right? So we have the Mosaic covenant with Moses, which is the priestly time. Then you have King David, and he brings about the kingly time. And then Elijah steps on the scene, and everything's about to change. He brings in the prophetic epic of time for God's people. Elijah is a really cool character in the Bible. I mean, reading through these stories over the last few weeks, I'm just like, man, I'm excited about this. This is just a really, really good story. Some ancient Jewish literature speaks about Elijah in ways that we'd say, yeah, he's actually better than some of these comic book characters, right? So some of these things that they would say in the ancient Jewish literature about Elijah, saying that then the prophet Elijah, it says that he arose like fire. Right? He steps onto the scene like fire. He comes in all of a sudden. He just shows up in the next verse that we're about to look at. It says that his word burned like a torch. He brought famine upon them, and by his zeal, he made them few in number. This ancient Jewish literature goes on to say, by the word of the Lord, he shut up heavens and also 3 times brought down fire. How glorious you were, O Elijah, in your wondrous deeds. And who has the right to boast which you have? You have raised a corpse from death and from Hades by the word of the Most High. Who brought kings down to destruction and famous men from their beds? It was Elijah who was covered by the whirlwind, and Elisha was filled with his spirit. Elijah's spirit. In all his days, he did not tremble before any ruler. Right? I love that. In all of his days, he did not tremble before any ruler, and no one brought him into subjection. Nothing was too hard for him. This is the reputation that Elijah has to the Jewish people in the Old Testament. Elijah is awesome. His name means, my God is Yahweh, which is fitting because that's his whole ministry. To say, my God is Yahweh, and he's better, he's stronger, and he will conquer your God, who is Baal. In fact, Jezebel is named after after the god Baal. Elijah wore an animal hide for a garment with a leather belt around his waist. He was powerful, filled with faith. He was a man who trusted God in the face of life-threatening danger. Elijah was the type of guy who was not afraid to go and pinpoint rebellion and sin in others and call them to repent. It's the type of character Elijah was. Elijah also had a heart for the less fortunate. He was a spirit-empowered man. The Spirit did a lot in the life of Elijah. Elijah raised people from the dead. He controlled the weather. He went to war with demonic prophets. He parted the Jordan so he could walk through, just like Moses and Joshua did before him. He called fire down from heaven multiple times. He provided an unending supply of oil and flour for a widow. He could even predict the future. And at the end of his life, he was taken into heaven by a tornado while riding a fiery chariot. I mean, really, Marvel's just ripping off the Bible in their stories. This is the original source. These are the better stories. Elijah is also a typological figure, right? He has connections all throughout the Bible. He's presented as a second Moses, right? Verses 17 through 19 of 1 Kings actually follow the pattern of Moses' life and Israel as well. Elijah is considered an eschatological prophet. He was the one that the prophets who came after him were saying, Elijah's going to come back. He's going to come back. Malachi, the last prophet in the Old Testament, says, we are still waiting for the one who's going to come in the spirit of Elijah. And when John the Baptist steps on the scene, he even dresses like him, right, with the fur and the belt and all that. And Jesus says, you are the greatest as you come in the spirit of Elijah. Jesus' own prophetical ministry is actually modeled after Elijah's. We see this in Luke chapter 4. Then on the Mount of Transfiguration, there are two characters in the Old Testament that are there with Jesus glorified. One is Moses, and the other is Elijah. Elijah is renowned in every Semitic faith, right? And anybody who claims Abraham as kind of the father of their religion, so this would be Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Elijah is held up as a great man in all of them. Elijah's reputation is astounding. And we meet Elijah in 1 Kings 17, verse 1. So let's turn there. 1 Kings 17:1. And Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe of Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. Except by my word. The very first verse of the Bible that mentions Elijah actually gives us a lot of information about what kind of guy he was. He goes directly to the king. He's a prophet that moves and he stands before God, and if he can stand before God, he's not afraid to stand before anyone else. Right? He goes directly to Ahab, who is in rebellion to Yahweh, and he speaks the words of God to Ahab. One of the roles of the prophets is to be a part of God's counsel. It is to stand before God. It's a unique office in the Old Testament, a privilege to go and stand in the presence of God and actually dialogue with God about the happenings of God's people and what takes place on earth. And then the prophet leaves the counsel of God and he goes and he speaks the words of God to the king. And what does Elijah say to Ahab? There shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. Ahab, this king, is probably thinking, who does Elijah think he is? Like, does Elijah have any clue of what I've been doing? I've created these temples. I've created these altars to Baal. I have Baal worship. Baal is the god of rain. Baal is the god of dew. Baal is the most powerful god in the world. And this crazy-looking prophet's going to come and talk to me and tell me that by his word, there will be no rain and there will be no dew until he speaks? This has got to be a joke. This has got to be a joke. Elijah standing before the king and saying these things is a high-handed threat to not only Ahab and Jezebel, not only to all the prophets of Baal, not only to the priests of Baal, but even to the entire nation of Israel. Because if this is true, crops die. Famine becomes rampant. Things change. And here Elijah stands before him, challenging this God, challenging Baal, saying, I come and I'm telling you that your God, Baal, who has all this power over the rain, over the crops, over the dew on the ground, he has nothing on Yahweh. And until I speak, there will not be a single drop of rain or a single drop of dew in the land. This is a challenge that drives the story of Elijah forward. It is this challenge that actually sets the whole stage for what's about to come in Elijah's life. And it's because of this challenge that we ultimately see the showdown between Yahweh and his prophet Elijah and Baal and his 400 some odd prophets. But this showdown doesn't happen for another 3.5 years. So what happens between this threat, Elijah standing before the king and absolutely dismantling his entire religious system and everything that his confidence is put in, everything that he worships? What happens between now and then? Well, crops begin to die, a drought comes, cattle dies, the economy suffers, and a famine begins. And Ahab and Jezebel are furious, and they want Elijah dead. So in verse 2, we see what God says next. Verse 2, it says this, and the word of the Lord came to him, that is Elijah. Depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Kerith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Kerith, that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. And after a while, the brook dried up, because there was no rain in the land. You see, God used Elijah in a moment to go and stand before the king and tell him what's coming. A famine is coming. I'm going to destroy Baal. Baal has zero power when it comes to Yahweh. This God that you serve is going to fall, and you're going to see his weakness. And then Ahab and all of his armies get really upset and say, and Jezebel even more so, which we'll see later, they want to kill him. So God says, all right, Elijah, you did your piece. You did what I asked you to do. Now I want to hide you because I'm going to use you in a couple years, coming back to challenge Baal face to face, mano a mano, your prophets versus the prophets of Yahweh. So for 3.5 years, Elijah is away from Samaria. He's away from his friends. He's away from his people. He's hiding out. And the first place he hides is by this brook Kerith. And it's at that place that God allowed Elijah to live. He was homeless. He's by himself. And God says, you can drink there. And not only that, but I'm going to bring ravens to feed you. And this is an interesting little thing because ravens are an unclean bird. Prophets, priests should not touch anything that a raven has touched. But God uses a raven to feed Elijah. And what we see happening is those ravens actually represent Gentile nations. And we see this playing out in Elijah's life, that it is the Gentiles that protect Elijah, God's prophet. And we see that contrast where these Gentile nations are actually following God's law and honoring God's prophets far more than the people of Israel are. Everything has changed. But God preserves Elijah's life by feeding him with these dirty birds. And when we read stories like this, oftentimes we can kind of sit back and say, man, look at God's provision. Like, look at how God provided supernaturally for Elijah. And we can be kind of taken back saying, man, God's provision of his people in the Bible is absolutely amazing. You could be reading it and you begin thinking about, man, Elijah was on his own. God brought him to this brook where he could drink. He had birds supernaturally bringing bread and meat morning and evening, which also follows the Moses life in Israel, right? They leave Egypt. They go into the wilderness. Elijah has just left the new Egypt, has gone into the wilderness, and God provides bread and meat for them to eat. It's like, man, look at God's provision. And we say this sitting on a nice, warm, comfortable recliner with the air conditioning at 71 degrees so you're not too hot, a belly full of good food, maybe a hot cup of coffee beside you. You think, man, look how God used to provide. I wish he would do that for me. You know, like, we think this way. I mean, I wish he would do that for me. I wish God would provide for me like he did Elijah. It's like, really? Like, let's just look around. Everything about our lives, the fact that we're all sitting here today is evidence of God's provision. It's evidence of God's generosity and his faithfulness. It's evidence of God's love for you and his blessing upon you. And we look at Elijah, homeless, living in the wilderness, eating food that birds drop down to him. And somehow we think, man, God's provision there is different. Well, it is different. His provision for us now is actually, I like it more. I prefer this than that. But we lose sight of the, if we dare call it the mundane, when we read stories about Elijah. We lose sight of what God is doing in our world, what God is doing in our community, what God is doing in our lives when we read some of these stories and say, man, I wish we had that. I wish we had fire coming down from heaven. You know, James talks about Elijah, and he makes a striking statement. He says, Elijah, this is James 5:17, it says, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. He prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months, it did not rain on the earth. He was a man with a nature like ours. Elijah had the same spirit in him that we have in us. We serve the same God as Elijah. We are in covenant with God. In fact, it's a better covenant, as Hebrews says, than Elijah had. When we look at the life of Elijah, he should inspire us. But we are not to compare and say, man, I wish that would happen here. But we are to say, you know what, God, Elijah is set forward as an example for us. Hebrews talks about this in Hebrews chapter 11, the hall of faith, a great example for us to run after, run the race as these men did. And we look at Elijah and we say, he had the boldness to speak the words of God to a culture that hated God. He had the boldness to live his life swimming upstream from the cultural current. He relied on the Spirit. He prayed fervently. He was a man of prayer. He was bowing down to God constantly. We'll see this throughout his story. He was constantly praying to God. And God is ready to work. He's ready to work today in our lives and in our communities and in our jobs. And what Elijah says to us is to say, be men and women like Elijah. Don't be like Ahab. Don't bow yourself to the idols that are in this world of entertainment and being comfortable and gaining resources. Be like Elijah. Be willing to go speak the words of God, even if that means you become homeless and you get fed by birds. Be that man. Be that woman. This is what God is calling us to. God is calling us to boldly stand in a place and speak the words of God to a culture and a people that need to hear them. And by God's grace, His Spirit will work in us, work in you, in us as a church, and we'll see people come to faith in Jesus. I'm looking forward to continuing this story next week as we see Elijah meets a widow and does some pretty awesome miracles for her. Let's pray. Father, you are a